Welcome to our history presentation today. I'm so happy to see all of you. I'm Betsy Callums. I think everybody in here probably knows me, except I'm not sure if I've known you before that. I'm Betsy Callums, the city's historic preservation planner, and I'd like to welcome you to our history presentation about Nathan Meeker by Katie Henry. I am going to pass it off to the museum manager, Chris Bowles, to do the introduction. Chris?
All right. Thank you, Betsy. Hi, everybody. I am super excited that Katie has agreed to give this talk. She's been doing a ton of research, not just on Nathan Meeker, but on Meeker's connection to Greeley and specifically our museum, and the whole history of how we've interpreted Meeker over the years. And so it's really exciting to kind of hear some of her research. So Katie comes to us originally from Minnesota, and she went to school at St. Kate's, got her undergrad there, and then she's now getting her master's in public history at the University of Nebraska in Kearney. So, and then when that's all done, we've got her forever. So I'll just hand it off to Katie, and thanks very much.
So I'm Katie, and as Chris said, I am both a student and I work here at the City of Greeley Museums. In my work as a grad student, I've been doing a bunch of research, and so this presentation is going to get into some of the research that I've been doing. Not all of it, because it's not done yet. When will it ever be done? But we'll get into some of it. And some of the things that we're going to consider today are the death of Nathan Meeker. That's the specific event and the memory of it and the history of it that we're going to kind of dig into a little bit of it. Explore the ideas and definitions of history and memory more generally, and then we'll get into history and memory as it comes to Nathan Meeker. We'll get into some of the context of Meeker's death and the events that followed. And then we're going to ask who remembers Nathan Meeker and how and why they remember him. So in just a minute here, I'll have a question for you folks, and then we'll go through the presentation. And then I would like to hear your thoughts, kind of a little bit of a discussion on Nathan Meeker and all the things we're going to go through today. So please feel free to ask questions, jump in. We'll get started. So again, these are the main questions we're going to consider. How he's been remembered, how might these memories have impacted, how he's been interpreted over time, both at the museum and for the public. And then at the end, we'll chat about how might the museum use this information to reinvigorate the Meeker Home Museum. So let's start with history and memory. For many people, including myself, these are kind of hard to separate. They're certainly deeply connected to one another, and sometimes they are the same thing, which is confusing. But for the purpose of this study, we can consider them as unique but related. And I'm going to read this, so bear with me. I know it's a long quote. So this is from historian David Blight. It was written in about 20 years ago. And he writes that if history is shared and secular, memory is often treated as a sacred set of absolute meanings and stories, possessed as the heritage or identity of a community. Memory is often owned, history interpreted, memory is passed down through generations, history is revised. Memory often coalesces in objects, sites, and monuments, and history seeks to understand context in all their complexity. So that's a lot, but for our purposes, we can summarize all that into history as the study of the past, what happened and why it happened, and memory as how we engage with the past, how we find and create meaning from it. And I think kind of a visual that will help us, I have to shout out Gus here, who helped me create the visual for this. Two heads are better than one, as a ripple effect. So at the center of our ripple, we have the history. What happens, in our case at White River, and why it happens. That is the history. The ripples expand as time passes and people tell stories about that history and about that event, and then later people tell stories about those stories. Historians, researchers, museum professionals, anybody who's interested in history, as we research, as we explore these histories, we're diving back through layers and ripples of memory to find a history that makes sense for us. So, here's my question for you folks. So that's a little bit of context. We'll explore it a little bit more later. I want to know what you folks know about Nathan Meeker already. Who is he? What do you know about him? Yeah, Katie.
Newspaper editor?
Yeah, newspaperman, absolutely. Yes.
They became interested in going to the West
Mm-hmm.
and which for Horace Greeley.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Was in conception with errors
Mm-hmm.
that came out on Hubbard's stories and so out of the U.S. history.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, you decided to popularize part with me and the Senate. It was also those figure people that fly to me in this short.
Yeah.
Consisted of Joe and Brian. I sit on the heart.
Uh-huh.
I know it's two ways.
Uh-huh.
And they were also important to that's what you were open. Came with him and searched all over the place.
Yeah.
Areas that might work for his technology. One of the people that calls him, when I learned about this after I moved to Colorado Springs,
Mm-hmm.
I was going on this there in Washington, but surely I'm telling you here with some of the folks that were teaching.
Uh-huh.
And lo and behold, something I never heard in the whole 20 hours that we could have been was that General Collins was already found out the town there in the area.
Yep.
And we told him, I got the perfect place for you to call him.
Mm-hmm.
And we were carrying on, of course, in each other in Civil War days.
Uh-huh.
But he and Meeker should not agree about liquor.
About liquor?
Cole's wife was Stevens, and he could see what's wrong with him, has glass of wine and dinner. And they're not dressed in a green on the streets.
Uh-huh.
But there's nothing wrong with liquor.
Yeah.
They couldn't agree about it.
Mhm.
Same for me for ultimately said, I probably could have good enough look like here anyway. They didn't look. And it came back out here, it ended up finding it was here.
Yeah.
Then a year after that, a few months, Caroline, Colin Renify, Caroline said, will you come home out of United City? So Caroline and the area in Colorado Springs.
Uh-huh.
And then Caroline came back to Greeley. Then before it comes, who they're called, that's Caroline didn't have a bus. So Caroline also went to the finding of
Wow. He's everywhere.
Caroline, so they came back to Greeley. So more than you ever wanted to know. The part that I've been so fascinated about and all the times that I learned about it as a kid, starting with the fourth grade, so they started teaching us social history. I've never known about the Colorado Springs piece.
Yeah.
Living down where this would have been really in front of a hot speak every day.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's what we meant.
Yeah. Yeah. Meeker pops up all over Colorado if you dig deep enough. He's everywhere. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? What do we know about Nathan Meeker? Yeah, Gus.
He really liked the idea of utopia towns.
Absolutely.
And he, after participating in a couple of them, thought that he could have some ideas to make it work better.
Yeah.
Then he
Definitely.
tried to apply it in Greeley.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we pretty much said all these things. He was a social reformer, he was a writer, he was an agriculturalist, he was a father and a husband. He was married to Arvilla, and they had several children together. We'll hear about those children in a little bit here. He helped found Greeley, and he was an Indian agent, which we'll get into a little bit more as well. So, let's add a few more details and dates to what we already know about Meeker, particularly about his death. So Meeker comes to Greeley, they establish the colony in 1870. He and the colonists arrive here, they establish the colony. In 1872, Horace Greeley dies, and his daughters call in Meeker's debts. Meeker owed about $1,000 to Greeley, who was the main benefactor of the town by the time Greeley died, and his daughters were very concerned about getting that money back. In 1878, Meeker, with help from Colorado Senator Henry Teller and several other politicians at the time, he's appointed as the agent at the White River Agency, which serves the Parianuch and Yampa bands of youth people. He did this to raise money to pay off his debts. He also hired his wife and his daughter to work at the agency with him to get their income as well. From 1878 to 1879, Meeker makes a lot of changes at the agency. One of the big ones that caused a lot of consternation among the youth people that lived there was that he moved the treaty-ordained agency site and all the buildings directly down onto prime grazing and racing land, which was not a good choice for the youth people. In August of 1879, Nakagat, who is also known as Captain Jack, if you read any stories about them, he appeals to Governor Pitkin. He goes to Denver from the agency and appeals to Governor Pitkin, says Meeker is making too many changes, he's not being entirely forthright with us, he's telling us one thing one day and then something different happens the next day, we would like a new agent. Pitkin hears him out and basically says, okay, thank you, and then sends him on his way. So not a lot comes out of that. In early September of 1879, Meeker decides that it's time to plow some land near the agency on, again, this prime grazing and racing land for the Ute people, and he threatens to arrest and imprison anyone who keeps him from doing so. Canala, also called Johnson, is a Ute leader at the time. He confronts Meeker. There's different stories about what actually happened. Canala reports that he grabbed Meeker's shoulder to try and drive home his point. Meeker claims and claimed that he had been assaulted, that he had been shoved off of the porch and injured. Either way, Meeker sends a letter to politicians and the army to request military protection for him and his family. Major Thornburg is kind of another one of our players. He's up in Wyoming. He's the closest one, and so he starts moving south towards White River. Later that month, this is still September, Thornburg meets both Nakagat and Colorado, who are two Ute chiefs of the White River Ute people, and he assures them that he will not bring his entire troop onto the reservation, that he will not cross Milk Creek, because, essentially, and they warn him, if he crosses onto the agency with his entire troop, that will be considered an act of war. The battle happens anyway because Thornburg does cross onto the reservation without conferring with the troop chiefs. There's some evidence to suggest that he did try to confer with them, but a shot, nobody really knows who it was fired from, a shot rings out and the battle breaks loose. That same day, later that same day, upon hearing of Thornburg's invasion, the Ute people at the agency set fire to the buildings. They kill Meeker and the men of the agency, and they take Arvilla, his wife, Josephine, his daughter, and the wife of another agency employee, Flora Ellen, and her 2 children hostage. Later in October, Army reinforcements arrive at Milk Creek, and the siege is ended. That ends that battle. Later in October, General Adams, who was a former Indian agent at the same agency, who knew Ore and other Ute leaders and was familiar with their movements and their beliefs, he secures the release of Josephine, Arvilla, Flora Ellen, and her family, and they return to Greeley. In 1881, all of this kind of snowballs And in 1881, the US Army ends up forcibly removing the Uncompahgre and White River bands of Ute people to Utah. And then to kind of round out our story here, we're going to stop at around the time Josephine Meeker dies in Washington, D.C. in 1882. So that's our timeline. So we've got the event. Now let's get on to the next circle of our ripple of memory. Who it happens to. Who is involved in those events directly, and who those events happen to. Here we have some people. We're not going to consider the perspective of the several Ute bands involved directly and peripherally in the events of Meeker's death today, but it's worth giving faces to the names of the leaders involved in the incident. So we have Nikaga up on the top left, also known as Captain Jack. He was involved in the Battle of Milk Creek and was the Ute leader who had petitioned Governor Pitkin to replace Nathan Meeker. We have Kent, also known as Douglas. He was involved in the violence at the agency and in taking Josephine, Arvilla, and Flora Ellen hostage. And then another band is Ore and his wife Shitowich, also known as Shashin or Susan. They helped negotiate the release of the hostages and participated very heavily in the investigations into the incidents of Meeker's death and all that surrounded it. So, Josephine and Arvilla, they had been at the agency working there for quite a while. Josephine was about 19 or 20 in 1879 when all of this starts happening. Arvilla was in her 60s. They had both worked at the agency with Nathan to help boost the family's income to pay off the debt quicker. Josephine was very interested and invested in learning and connecting with the Ute people at White River. She not only was the teacher, she taught a few of the children there that came to the agency school, but she became friends with many of the women in the band. She learned, there's a story that she learned how to smoke a pipe with some of them. And she went to the pony races, and she was actually chastised by her father for getting too close to them, for learning too much about their culture. After her father's death and her captivity, Josephine, as well as Arvilla and Flora Ellen, caught the imagination of the entire nation. Their stories were printed and reprinted in newspapers around the country, and Josephine's story was even printed just within months of her rescue, before the end of the year in 1879, within months of her release. Later editions of this book, that's the title page of it right here, also include her mother's story, as well as Mrs. Price's story. So these stories, particularly the women's stories, reprinted all over the United States. And their reprintings, they use and characterize the events of Josephine's father's death as a massacre, which some of us might know that in recent times has come under a little bit of scrutiny as to the accuracy of that characterization. Was it a massacre? What happened? Is there anybody at fault? What really happened there? However, massacre described the events and what they meant to the people in Colorado and in the United States at that time. And we can glean a lot from exploring kind of that meaning. So in 1879, Colorado was still a territory, and the frontier hadn't fully closed yet. There was still very much a consciousness in the people of the West, in Colorado and Wyoming, all over the West, that it was still very much wild. It was the Wild West still. And many settlers still feared violence from Native Americans and the process of settlement, traveling to the West. And they also were worried about the uncertainty of the future of American expansion. Not all the treaties had been signed yet. The Ute people, particularly in Colorado, still occupied basically the whole western half of the state, which many settlers wanted for farming. To them, Meeker, after his death, was a martyr to the cause of civilization and kind of a case in point to justify their fears of violence and war. But Josephine had a very unique perspective on this event. She was certainly influenced by all of this kind of general consciousness and this fear that was happening at the time. But her perspective is worth mentioning, if only to highlight her resilience and just incredible intelligence. In November of 1879, about a couple weeks after she was rescued, the Osceola Record of Nebraska printed a version of her story in which she describes a scene during her captivity. I'm going to read just a few of the highlighted pieces here, but keep in mind that as she's writing this, she has experienced immense trauma. She's witnessed her father dying. She has been taken hostage by people that she sometimes trusts and sometimes is very uncertain about. She's experienced violence, and there's a lot of uncertainty at this point. She doesn't know when she's going to be rescued or if she's going to be rescued at all. And yet she's willing and able to recall with a very clear head the complex causes of her experience. So here she's describing Chief Douglas, who comes up to her, and he said, quote, "My father had written all the letters to the Denver papers and circulated wild reports about the Indians, what the Indians would do, and was responsible for all the hostility against the Indians among the whites in the West. While Douglas was telling this, he stood in front of me with his gun, and his anger was dreadful. He said father had always been writing to Washington. Then he swore a fearful oath in English and said if the soldiers had not come and threatened the Indians with Fort Steele and the calaboose or jail, and threatened to kill other Indians at White River, the agent would not have been massacred." That is pretty significant from someone who has witnessed all of this violence to herself. Can you imagine if that was you? Would you be able to hold these complex beliefs and be able to talk about your father's killers like this? Oops, too far. So this is just another snippet of how poignant and kind of visceral these stories were for the entire nation. They were printed all over. So we have the Rocky Mountain News, a little snippet from that, and then another snippet from the New York Herald, which was the newspaper where Ralph Meeker, Nathan and Arvilla's surviving son, worked. And just kind of imagine how that newspaper, what stories they would have printed about this event if the son of the man who was murdered worked for that newspaper. Now, let's consider Rosine. She was Josephine's older sister. She had been in Greeley at the Meeker house while her family was at the agency. She did not experience any of the violence firsthand, but she did lose her father and did have to grapple with the realities of her mother and her sister's experience. Rosine, like Josephine, took to the newspapers and even the lecture circuit. She went on lectures all over the West. But her messages were quite different from Josephine's. Where Josephine tells the story, recounts the events, Rosine takes a rather racially charged perspective, and she gets very political very quickly. So this is a letter from the Cheyenne Weekly Leader from December of the year, so just a few months after this had happened. And Rosine writes, "Now we Colorado people are getting somewhat tired of this farce, and we invite the miners, the cowboys, and all other good people to see to it that these Indians never leave Colorado soil alive by simply putting a rope necktie around the neck of each, which is fit close and snug, thereby relieving these murderers and their friends at Washington of all further anxiety." Very, very strong opinions. She goes on to say, to describe what she sees as a kind of ring of corruption in the United States government, in the Department of the Interior, and extending into the Army, and that this corrupt Indian ring, which controls the power in the land to a great degree, is daily wringing thousands of dollars from that which is due to the poor Indians. This is why it is their policy to favor the Indians and not to bring these murderers to justice. So she is responding to the investigations and the peace commissions that have been happening as Chief Ore, General Adams, other leaders, special agents sent by both the military and the Department of Interior are investigating these events and trying to figure out what happened. Greeleyites also voiced opinions, certainly in the Greeley Tribune, but also in newspapers with broader audiences like the Rocky Mountain News, coincidentally, the owner of which, William Byers, had helped Meeker purchase the land that grew in Union Colony. Will Byers was also very much for removal and expansion into Western Colorado. The campaign slogan was "The youth must go," and he was a pretty strong proponent of that. So from this source here, there's a lot, we don't need to read it all. But Greeleyites took ownership of Meeker as one of their own, and their perspective here reveals the differences between East and West, between Eastern and Western newspapers as they're printing and responding to this event. The questions that they're considering at this time are questions of the Indian question. What should we do about the Indians in the West? Should the relationship with the United States be handled by the Department of the Interior? Should the relationship with the Native Americans be handled by the Army? Are they sovereign nations? Are they wards of the state? How do we think about these people and what they mean to the United States? All this was informing how people remembered Meeker's death and what it means at the time. So, just a couple snippets here. This is a bunch of resolutions that were passed during the Meeker women's captivity, but before they were rescued. And these are from, this whole list is from the people in Greeley. And one of the things I want to draw your attention to is that they resolve that we indignantly denounce the graceless insinuations and gratuitous assertions of some Eastern papers that this defection among the youths is the result of bad faith on the part of the agent and the people of Colorado as wholly unfounded in fact and made in a fault-finding spirit among people entirely ignorant of the situation and of the Indian character. So from this, we can see that people in the West have they view their relationship to the Native Americans and the reservations and the people here as unique. They are the ones that know the realities of what it's like to live in the West. They know the realities of the frontier. And those Easterners, those politicians, they don't know anything. They don't understand. They can never understand because they don't live out here. So, we've got the event. We've got who it happens to. We have the women. We have people in Greeley. Then, we can keep expanding our circle here to include later generations of people, telling the story of Meeker's death and its meaning, what it means to them in their time for reasons that are relevant and important to them. So, Meeker remained a very important identifier for the city of Greeley, so much so that the citizens organized a memorial association, a memorial bust, and finally, a memorial museum, which brings us pretty much to today. No, just kidding. We'll go through it. So here we have from about 1900 the Meeker Memorial Association. They had been created originally. It was primarily a women's group, but not exclusively. Women from Greeley who created this association. They wanted to expand the public library. Originally, it was the Meeker Memorial Library Association, but they eventually grew into wanting to preserve the Meeker home as a memorial site. There's also the Meeker Memorial Bust. There is a bust of Nathan Meeker. It used to be downtown by the old city hall before it was reconstructed down there. Now it's at the Meeker Museum site. And then we have these curators here. George Hodson, sometime before 1959, Helen Larson in 1959, and then one of the women in the picture, the black and white picture in the bottom right, is Hazel Johnson, who did so much work and so much research, and who's after whom the research center downstairs was named after. These people and the Museum Association built and created both the association, the bust, the museum, all of this to preserve and share the memory of Meeker. It is a memorial museum, it is a memorial bust, and they probably didn't define memory in the way that we are right now for this research, but they were certainly preserving stories of Meeker that meant things to them, that resonated the most with them, and what they thought was important for the community to know. So we get stories of Meeker as a town founder, as a pioneer, as an idealist, someone they and the community could identify with and be proud of. So as they're building this, stories about Meeker's death and all that violence kind of shift to the periphery. And the stories of Meeker as a pioneer, as a founding father, take center stage. Now, this is kind of where we're at now, or some snippets of it. So we have from our website, the Meeker Home Museum, and the description of it there. The description of Meeker Home Museum there does not include any details about Meeker's death. And the question is, should it? Should it include anything about his death? What responsibility does the museum have today to talk about Meeker's death and those impacts, both in the community of Greeley and around the country? Because he was connected very closely to the whole westward expansion movement and all of those themes of what is the Indian policy, what is the role of the Army, who are Native Americans and their tribes to the United States. On the bottom here, we can't really see it, but it is the timeline snippet from the Southern Ute Tribal website, and it describes Meeker shows up in the timeline of their history. So their history starts way back, like prehistory. But this is just a snippet from about 1877 to 1881. It mentions Nathan Meeker is the agent. It talks about Thornburg being killed for violating an agreement with the Utes. And it talks about Meeker's attempt to change the lifestyle of the Utes failing, resulting in the demise of Meeker and 11 others. So this is another memory, another perspective on the events that happened. Entirely different from ours. Here in Greeley, Meeker is the town founder. He's very much connected to the foundation of the city, but for the Ute people, he's a blip in their timeline. And also, another thing, what's the events? How should we characterize the events today? That poster is up in the gallery over there, and the poster Ute Uprising or Meeker Massacre is also at the Meeker Home Museum, and it is the only mention inside the house of Meeker's death and the controversy of it. So, before we get to that, one thing I want us to consider is that the museum has, because it grew out of the Meeker Memorial Museum, we have a legacy of preserving memory to sift through, as well as controversies to address and more perspectives than our own to include in the storytelling. Do we have a responsibility to do that? Is that the responsibility of the museums? If it is, where should it be done? How should it be done? Should it be done at the Meeker home site? Should it be done here? Should it be done in classrooms? How should we do that, and should we do it at all? So this is just to round out some of the ripples here. So at the center, again, what happens at White River and why it happens. In the first circle, we have Josephine, Arvilla, Nathan himself, Nakagat, Kent, and the other folks. In the story outside of that, people who did not directly experience the events, we have Rosine, writers in the Greeley Tribune, Greeleyites, folks from the New York Herald, and Ralph Meeker, who wrote quite a bit about it as well. He wrote his own versions of what happened at White River from secondhand reports. But again, both Ralph and Rosine, in addition to Josephine, the whole family became kind of an authority on the event. And even though Ralph and Rosine are writing from secondhand accounts, they're taken as gospel. This is what happened. And then finally, on the outer circle, we have more people telling more stories in a new time for reasons that are relevant and important to them. So, that's our ripple of history and memory altogether. Let's revisit our definitions from the beginning. History as the study of the past, memory as how we engage with the past and how we find and create meaning from it. Can we answer now that we've gone through some of this? Any questions from the beginning? Can we answer how has Nathan Meeker been remembered over time? How might these memories have impacted how Meeker has been remembered over time? And how might the museum use this information to reinvigorate the Meeker home? So that's kind of the end of my presentation, of me talking at you all. And I'd like to hear your thoughts as community members, as people who might be invested in this story, or in Greeley, which connects to Meeker. Yes?
There really is a question, because in my mind, I always thought that the part of what a Tyrion from Letters Guy was, like the way I hear it was almost like it's just prime real estate, and that's really where that needed to be, maybe with agency building.
Mm-hmm.
But in my mind, for some reason, I always had this narrative that said it was partially like a moral thing, and we don't like you with the racetrack, so we're going to tear that up. Is that narrative not? I don't know where I got that from. I have no idea. Was it really just that it was prime real estate? It's like, oh, that's really where that needs to be. Or was it also kind of like, we don't like you racing because that's immoral?
I think it was a little bit of both. Definitely, Meeker was operating, when he made that choice, he was operating with the sense of he had, a directive from the government to develop this land and civilize these people. So there was definitely that. But it also does seem that, part of that is that there's kind of a moral high ground. We are civilized, I am civilizing you, therefore you are below me and I know best. And I think there was some of that in there.
It certainly wasn't taking into consideration, like, oh, what happened to you here? Because that's the greatest thing about this.
No, not really.
Yeah, his whole thing, because he was such an agriculturalist, was establishing an agricultural area for effectively his new colony. He was trying to do what he did in Greeley at White River. And so water was the source, and their grazing ground was on the river. So for him, it was just like water, agriculture, and he wasn't thinking at all about the uses that the youth have for it.
Did he know he was the face in range from?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes. Yeah. We did. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions or comments? Yes.
So how's the interpretation at the Meeker House? How has that changed over time from when it was first established as a memorial museum to what it is now? Because even though it only has like one reference to the characterization of Meeker's death, are there other elements that have changed in that interpretation?
I would say yes. I haven't done all the research on that I want to, and that I plan to, but it does seem that at the very beginning, in 1920-ish, the Meeker Home Museum is the only museum in Greeley, and it is kind of the main focus of all the history, and people who are thinking about history and want to learn about history, they're coming to that site. And so at that time, there's still a little bit of martyrdom associated with Meeker's memory there. And there's also a little bit about him being a pioneer. because in the 1920s, early 1900s, the generation of pioneers like H.G. West and the other folks who came with Meeker to Greeley, they're aging and they're passing on they want to pass on their legacy to the next generation. And that generation is trying to preserve the legacy of their parents, and Meeker for them is kind of a place to kind of rally around, so he becomes a pioneer and he's celebrated with kind of this pioneer heritage. As time passes though, and then the museum gets absorbed into the city, it takes on a little bit of a different flavor, and the emphasis switches to more of a town founder, because that is the history that's relevant to the organization that's talking about Meeker. He becomes important as a pioneer again around the 1970s, around the bicentennial, but not quite as much. There's not as much attention on the Meeker home at that time because Centennial Village is growing. So as new histories and people tell stories differently, he kind of falls a little bit to the wayside. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Can you talk a little bit about 1959 when the museum is completely revamped and the choices that are made there and kind of what your thinking is around that?
Could you say more words?
So, yes. So at that time, there was a historic preservation decision made to
About the
remove,
physical structure of the house?
to remove our villa's extensions and bring it back to the original adobe two-story building.
Yes.
And then, but still keep it as a museum. And I don't know if that's when the house museum was developed or if the house museum was there before that, and then it just consolidated. I do know that like the extension where the kitchen now is was built in that time in '59.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I don't know if you've given a stop to all of that.
So it was a historic house museum, and one of the curators actually lived there because there was enough room at that time for him to live there. Baby Copeland, I think his name was. So he actually lived at the site and maintained it himself. And then part of the reason, there's parts of your question that I think I can answer, not all of it, but so when it got absorbed into the city and those structural changes were made, again, that was about what story they want to tell at that time, what is relevant for the city and what they want to say to people at that time, and I think it was the pioneer story that they really wanted to highlight, the founder story. So they stripped down the site, they took off the additions that didn't connect directly to that story, and it was just a square that told the pioneer story, so that's what they needed, and that's what they wanted to emphasize. With that though, they lost a lot of other stories. They lost Arvilla's story. She and Rosine lived in that house until, Rosine lived there until the late, 1910-ish, and Arvilla lived there with her for that whole time until Ralph came and got her. There's a lot of sibling drama that went into that, which is kind of cool to research. But we lose Arvilla's story in that, and the kind of domesticity and what happened in that house. And part of this research I'm going to get into, hopefully, is house museums and what they can tell us about not just the past and important people like Nathan Meeker, but what about the everyday life and the realities of living in that house? What was Arvilla's life like? What did she believe? What did she think? How did it show up in her house and how she built it and the choices that she made there? What was it like to be a woman like Arvilla or Josephine who had experienced violence and trauma and captivity in a world that just grabbed onto their stories and used them as political fodder, as fodder for gossip? What was it like for them to experience that? So I think there's a lot of really personal stories that get lost with the loss of a structure. Yeah.
It seems to me that one way to bring in Meeker's depth into the site is starting with how the museum was founded. It's founded as a memorial site. So that really, I think, opens up
Mhm.
that conversation into why you need a memorial. for
Yeah,
Meeker.
absolutely.
And so it can, is less forcefully, really, say, starting just with,
Right.
he was killed.
Yeah.
Bring it in as,
As
well,
part of
this
the story.
started as a memorial, and then going back to those events now on it. That seems like
Yeah.
maybe a less, brutal or less confrontational
Yeah.
way to really it was about applying that history. Definitely, we open it up more as a conversation.
Yeah, and that's kind of a move in historic house interpretation and preservation in general. So this is one of the books that I read for this research, and one of the things they talk about in there is that historic houses don't. Maybe we should move away from historic houses talking about a particular frozen moment or a particular time or person, and include the history of the house itself in the history that people learn at that site. So we could learn about, instead of learning about just Nathan Meeker and the founding of Union Colony and what it was like to be a pioneer here in the 1870s, you can also learn about A.B. Copeland and Helen Larson and the other curators who made changes and made choices and influenced how we understand and talk about the history.
I just have two questions. When and how was the Meeker Home transferred to the city, ownership wise?
Details on that, I yeah, 1929, and it was absorbed into.
29 is when the city bought it.
Oh,
59 is when it was
Yes.
absorbed into the new city charter as home rule.
yes, yes. So they bought it in 29, and then in 59 it became absorbed, yes, into the new culture department, which was also new in 1959.
Is there any history about this family and how they financially supported that piece with
A little bit. I do know a little bit about that. So they took in boarders at their house. So at that time, the house was big enough to take in boarders and for them to live there. And then Rosine also tried to raise money with her lectures around the United States and the West. So those were two things. And Rosine, I think she was also a dressmaker or of some kind, so she also did that kind of work as well. But they also, Josephine went to work for the Department of the Interior for one of the politicians that helped get Nathan Meeker his job at the agency. Then she sent money back. Ralph was sending money back to his family from New York. So it was kind of a family affair. Well, thank you all so much for your attention and taking the time to come and chat. I appreciate it. Yeah.